Hello everyone. Today this article is still a study on student engagement and published in the journal called Studies in Higher Education, a top-ranking journal in the field of higher education. And it is first a theoretical piece, but they test their model with survey data and with SEM, structural equation modeling, as a data analysis technique. Overall, in the abstract, they talked about they're using a holistic perspective to view students' engagement and students' experience, in other words. And they specifically examined different factors that could be important for students' engagement. Those factors are involvement and expectation, which are two antecedents that they called, like antecedent factors. And then they defined four dimensions of engagement: affective, social, cognitive, and behavioral engagement. And then kind of that's the student engagement factors themselves. And the outcome factor are including institutional outcome and students' outcome, personal outcomes. So after they build up the model and build up a lot of hypotheses about the interrelationship among those factors, they build up a survey using actually already existing and well accepted items from like the constructs of all those factors. They combine them together and make a survey and distribute that survey to an top-ranking research university in Australia, specifically business school students and faculty members. And they collected data and used a structural model to analyze the different weights for different factors. And they said that they have a valid assessment, the fit of the model is high, stuff like that. And they made some conclusions about the interrelationships. And it's quite intuitive because they already built a model well supported with literature. And the finding is basically similar to what they hypothesized, which is there is a strong interrelationship between students' expectation, involvement to their different dimensions of engagement. And also those engagement strongly influence students themselves, their well-being and like personal outcomes, as well as the institutional reputation and other outcomes. So that's overall the article is all about. And in the introduction, they talked more detailedly about why they're conducting this study, because like student experience is increasingly popular in education field, although using different words like student engagement, student involvement, academic involvement, student experience, things like that. While the current approach is more about evaluation on students' behavioral performance and evaluation on teaching. So as a approach to reflect students' engagement. And they say it is not holistic, and they are using holistic approach here in their study. They critiqued that previous studies are all surveys of one dimension, one specific dimension of student engagement, and even the student engagement's definition is not holistic enough. And it's more of the goal of assessing students' experience and engagement is problematic because the purpose is for staff reduction instead of really supporting students' engagement and experiences. So they made several critiques in their introduction in order to set up for the justification of their approach, which is holistic, like viewing student experience as transformative, and it is like about students' identity instead of just their satisfaction or behavioral performance, stuff like that. So they also say like traditional success factors are not enough. There are holistic outcomes for students with this engagement and experiences in higher education. So they set up their study to study the interrelationships among all those holistic, many factors they're interested in. So that's their introduction, successfully paved their way to justify their study and research question. They continue with this section called a theoretical framework, which is a kind of literature review, saying like student engagement is such a popular concept disguised in different conceptualization, including students' experience, research-led teaching, and stuff like that, like concepts like that. And they say they use student engagement in their study because it's recently getting accepted, more consistently used by scholars. And they defined what is student engagement. It is a holistic concept. It is a meta construct and involving a ecosystem of students and those people connected with students. So it's a kind of holistic review, a view of students' engagement. They highlight that this concept is such a multi-dimensional construct. And then they kind of already starting justifying the 4 dimensions of the construct, which they will talk about it in more detail in the later sections. So basically the 4 dimensions are social, cognitive, affective, and behavioral engagement. So after they kind of set up their core idea, the core concept, which is student engagement, they continue to talk about the different factors they are focusing on. The first group of factor are called antecedents to student engagement. This can include 2 specific factor. The first is expectation, like students' expectation on their experiences in higher education. Like at universities, and they kind of talked about what has been discussed between the relationship of one's expectation and their real experiences in higher education. They built a model like this, like not only talked about expectation, but also involvement. And they discussed the relationship between involvement and student engagement here in this section. And this is a kind of overall hypothesis, like their first 4 hypotheses about the relationship between this antecedents factor and students' engagement, as well as their outcomes. And then they talked more, as I said, in more detail about the 4 dimensions, the 4 pillars of students' engagement. And they basically defined what are the 4 dimensions are in this section. And then they talked more about these outcome factors, including institutional and personal outcomes. And they basically, again, talked about their hypotheses here in each section, like which are basically their hypothesis about the interrelationship among those engagement and those institutional or personal students' personal outcomes. And they highlights the different personal outcomes for students, including to kind of just justify why they're using a holistic view, because they say students' outcome are holistic. It is about a transformative learning process, and it is about students' psychological factors, including self-efficacy, self-esteem. So it's holistic. It's not only students' academic performance, but also about their identity, right? So that's how they set up all their model and like literature review and to justify all the factors they are focusing on. Then they talked about their research methodology, which is like based on our model we just talked about. We designed a survey, and the survey is well designed because it's using well accepted scales of those already existed constructs from the field.
And they say they're conducting this study in a university, and they collected those survey data and analyzed it with a two-step structural equation modeling. And those are some technical words, like basically saying their model is valid. They tested the convergent validity and discriminant validity. They displayed their index of like confirmatory factor analysis index, and also other index, Tucker-Lewis index, and I provided some explanation here, and you can just read, maybe pause this video and read um, to understand what does like those technical terms mean. But basically, the overall goal is to demonstrate that the data they collected and the model they built based on their hypothesis are basically a good fit. So their model is kind of valid, and thus their data analysis and the results will be reflecting somehow a large amount of the data. So the variance explained. Um, the results are kind of like what I said. It's pretty much about all those hypotheses they build, which is about the interrelationships among all those factors, and it's basically a like they're testing it, and basically they find out they're all true, so almost all, instead of some weak relationship, which I highlighted here. I think there is a weak relationship between, for example, I think social behaviors here, social engagement and self-efficacy, stuff like that is not a very like it is not a very significant effect. For example, here, like all those statistics that do not have those stars here indicates that it is not a significant relationship. And so not this, it should be cognitive engagement with self-efficacy here, and cognitive engagement with self-esteem, and how behavioral engagement and cognitive engagement respectively related to transformative learning and well-being are not as high as they expected, as they hypothesized. So hypothesis not supported for those relationships. And they provided some implications, and we will talk a little bit more about those not supported hypotheses in the following section very briefly. So the implication overall is we need a holistic view of student engagement, because it is a transforming experience. It is not only academic, but also about students' well-being. And all things are interrelated, and including the antecedents, students' expectation and involvement, and how that related to the four pillars: cognitive, social, affective, and what is the other one? So the four pillars, I guess, cognitive engagements. So also the outcomes, like institutional personal outcomes. They also provide implications specifically for higher education involvement, like management. And they say like involvement is highly related with effective engagement. So maybe the staff can provide more partnerships to kind of build up those involvements, and also to guide students have realistic expectations, because it's related to students' effective engagement. And then to support students' emotional connections so that their well-being and transformative learning experience can be supported. By doing that, maybe staff can build up some communication and connections and made students' voice heard. They say there is a relationship between behavioral engagement and self-esteem and self-efficacy. So that might be something higher education staff can consider to encourage the culture of students like efforts, like encourage students to build up their self-efficacy. However, here, like I said, they do talk about those hypotheses that is not supported. For example, there is a weak connection between cognitive engagement with students' kind of experiences and the impacts on the experiences. But they say, although this is like a weak relationship, we still have to put some like focus on this cognitive engagement, because that is what university do. They teach students. And then they also talked about this weak relationship between institutional and student success with this social engagement. And while they say they find out a weak relationship, it is still important to support students' social engagement, because they, like literature do find out it has positive impact on students' success. And then they also say, apart from what they find and what they suggest, it is really up to the institution to decide what best work for them and their specific strategic vision. So they also suggest that future research should examine how their research in one university can be generalized to other universities and to other more diverse students body. While in conclusion, they say higher education should really learn about students' engagement with a holistic perspective. And their study kind of provided some tool for universities to understand that. And then they encourage higher education to continuously focusing on this area called student engagement and provide necessary best practices to support students' experience. Okay, thanks for listening. Hopefully you learned something today as well. I will keep updating and sharing interesting readings I read to you. If you like this video, please subscribe, thumb ups. Thank you very much.